Hey everyone, Bill here and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to do something really specific. We're looking strictly at how the Torah defines and handles impurity. We aren't going to be relying on human traditions or modern assumptions here. Instead, we're going to build an unbroken step-by-step biblical framework straight from the source. We're examining the actual mechanics of uncleanness, how it moves, how it's remedied, and ultimately how this exact rigid legal structure hands down a really surprising definitive verdict on a food we are all super familiar with: honey.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First up, we'll look at the source of uncleanness. Second, the motion of impurity. Third, the pattern of restoration. Fourth, we'll cover divine timelines for cleansing. And finally, we are going to bring it all together for our final verdict: death in the hive. Let's start building this proof.
Starting off with Section 1, the source of uncleanness, which is rooted in death and the loss of life.
Now, it's absolutely vital to grasp right out of the gate that the Torah doesn't treat uncleanness as some spooky superstition or just a metaphor. It's a very real condition that arises wherever life starts to break down. To anchor this whole teaching, we're looking at this direct mandate from Leviticus 10:10. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. To really understand how this force moves, we have to start at the fountainhead, the core states that actually generate this impurity.
When we dig into the law, it's fascinating. All sources of impurity share this one profound common denominator. They literally all mark encounters with things moving away from life. Think about it. A loss of seed, that's the lost potential of life. Childbirth marks new life entering a world of sin and death. The loss of blood is quite literally life being poured out. Dead flesh is life that has officially ended. Skin decay, well, that imitates death even while a person is still alive. And a human corpse represents the absolute highest boundary of mortality. Across all these different domains, uncleanness is really just a shadow cast by death and dying.
Moving right along to Section 2, the motion of impurity, or basically how uncleanness travels.
You see, the law lays out a highly organized framework for how this works. It transfers almost like motion in physics, passing from one thing to another, instantly changing what it touches. Our first category here is direct contact, and this brilliantly illustrates the law's consistency, because the Torah actually pairs animal and non-animal examples right side by side. On one hand, touching a dead swarming thing makes you unclean. On the other, touching a person with a human discharge does the exact same thing. Direct physical contact immediately transfers the uncleanness, totally regardless of the source. But what about when there's no direct contact? Well, next is indirect spread, or the carrier principle. Impurity can totally travel through intermediaries. Leviticus 11 shows us that if a dead insect falls onto an article of wood or skin, that object becomes a vehicle of impurity. Similarly, over in Leviticus 15, we see that a bed sat upon by someone with a discharge becomes unclean itself. So touching the vehicle that holds the impurity makes you unclean, even if you never laid a finger on the original source.
Now this is where it gets really intense. We reach a much more severe category: shared space. Here, physical touch isn't even required at all. If an insect falls into an earthenware vessel, Leviticus 11 tells us that everything inside it shall be unclean. The airspace itself is compromised. And we see this mirrored perfectly in the ultimate non-animal example in Numbers 19, when someone dies in a tent. Literally everyone and everything inside that tent becomes unclean. This potent impurity just fills the entire enclosed airspace or vessel system.
That brings us to Section 3, the pattern of restoration and the pathways back to holiness.
So, we've seen how this stuff spreads, right? But we also have to grasp the merciful remedies God established for returning to holiness. The fundamental rule here is that the physical material of the contaminated object dictates its cure. Step 1 is washing in water. That's your most common remedy for routine surface contamination of people or standard objects. But look closely at Step 2, breaking and scouring vessels. This is huge. Because porous items like earthenware actually soak up uncleanness into their walls, they can't just be washed. They have to be completely destroyed. Bronze, on the other hand, can be scoured. Step 3 involves passing highly durable metal spoils through extreme fire. And Step 4, reserved for the absolute highest form of uncleanness, contact with human death, requires the very specific ashes of the red heifer.
All right, Section 4, divine timelines for cleansing, where we look at time as a teacher of holiness.
In the legal framework of the Torah, purity is never instantaneous. God tailors the waiting period precisely to how severe the impurity is. Just notice how the tension builds across these timelines. We start with simply waiting until the evening. This is for your routine surface impurity. It resets at the setting of the sun. But if the impurity goes deeper, it escalates to a full 7 days, which demands a complete biblical cycle of separation. For human corpse contamination, it gets even stricter, requiring precise actions on the 3rd and 7th day milestones. If you skip a step, you ruin the whole timeline. But finally, we reach the absolute strictest grade, no time. This is a state of permanent, irreversible defilement. Literally no amount of time or waiting will ever restore it.
So what does this all mean? The crucial point hits us right here in Leviticus 11:33. When an unclean swarming thing falls into an earthenware vessel, it is unclean and you shall break it. Why? Because clay is porous. It absorbs the impurity deep down into its walls. Porous vessels struck by death have zero timeline for restoration. They fall straight into that permanent, no-time category and have to be shattered.
Now hold on to your hats, because it gets even more serious in the very next verse, Leviticus 11:34. Any food in it that could be eaten shall be unclean, and all drink that could be drunk from every such vessel shall be unclean. Think about the difference here. Unlike a vessel, which merely holds things, food and drink are designed to be internalized. Because of this, once impurity touches food or drink, it can never be rehabilitated. There is no washing, no filtering, and absolutely no timeline that can make unclean food clean again. It's done.
Which leads us to the climax, Section 5, Death in the Hive, and our final verdict. So here's the million-dollar question we have to ask ourselves as we leave human traditions behind and look at the raw facts. How does this strict, biblical legal blueprint we just outlined apply to the biological reality of a beehive? How do we pivot from the theoretical mechanics of the law to the practical, real-world honey harvest? Let's look at the actual biology for a second. A hive is not some pristine, sterile laboratory. In fact, thousands of bees naturally die inside the hive every single summer. First off, the hive functions as a shared containment vessel. The honey develops inside wax cells that are structurally completely intertwined with the exact spaces where thousands of bees live, labor, and die. Second, it functions as a shared airspace domain. Those dead bees remain in this shared airspace right alongside open nectar and ripening honey. The bees themselves are, by definition, unclean swarming things, and they are dying inside the very vessel that is holding the food. The containment itself mediates the impurity straight to the honey. So, based strictly on the mechanics of the law we just laid out, the biological verdict is undeniable. Bee honey falls into that 4th grade of divine timing. No time. It is permanently defiled. Because the food has contacted death inside a shared vessel, the contamination has already occurred. No amount of washing, no modern high-tech filtration system, and no amount of waiting around can ever reverse that contamination.
And you know what's amazing? We see this mechanical truth echoed everywhere else in Scripture. Job perfectly understood this principle of purity a long, long time ago when he asked in Job 14:4, "Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one." We didn't just start with Job and try to reverse engineer our way down to the hive. We started with the hive and we let the law take us exactly where it takes us. And when we finally look up, Job is already standing there, confirming the exact same mechanics of purity.
And Yeshua himself hit the nail right on the head too. Look at his words in Matthew chapter 7. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. We now have 3 massive scriptural witnesses, the Torah, Job, and Yeshua, all pointing to the exact same testimony. An unclean source does not and literally cannot yield clean food.
So as we wrap up this explainer, you're really left with a choice between 2 very different kinds of sweetness. There's the sweetness of human tradition, and then there's the ultimate sweetness of biblical obedience. What is unclean at the source simply cannot be made clean at the table. Will you continue to draw sweetness from what dies in its labor, or will you align with the pure mechanics of Yah's instructions? I'm Bill. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep seeking the truth in the text.